thank you for joining us today on Monday. I'm really excited for this talk, partly because lately, since reopening, I don't do very many virtual talks anymore. But whenever I do, it's usually about a topic that I have been researching that then really has sparked my interest. So it's perfect timing that this is Women's History Month. And as I've been researching for our current exhibit, The Wandering Years, which is about our early history before we were located in our present location in the Myers Mansion, I kept coming across these stories about the amazing women who contributed to the history of the Shaker Historical Society. And so I thought, okay, well, perfect timing, Women's History Month, why not do a talk on them? So again, I want to thank you for joining me today and to learn a little bit more about these women who are touched upon in the exhibit, but we don't have the space to go into a deep dive, and we are tonight. So, okay, there we go. So the first person I want to talk about is Edythe Turner. She was born in 1895 in Johnstown, Ohio. And her father was a United Brethren of Christ Church minister. And the church actually purchased Union Village. Oh, we have someone else joining. It was purchased by his denomination in 1812. And Union Village is another Shaker, or was another Shaker community in Ohio near Lebanon, Ohio. And it really sparked an interest for Edythe. She had seen photos of the Shaker village and a little bit of information about it, and she had never heard of the Shakers before. So that's really what kind of piqued her interest in the Shakers, which played a huge role in her work when she came to Shaker Heights. But before that, she went to Ohio University. She was in the class of 1918, and then did postgraduate work at a variety of institutions, including the University of Chicago, Columbia University in New York City, Western Reserve University, now known as Case Western Reserve, and then Cleveland College, which was also operated by Case. She moved to Shaker Heights in 1934 and began researching the Shakers for the Malvern third grade. So she had started at Malvern, later ended up at Onaway. But she was really interested in the Shakers based on this experience with her father's denomination. And she started to do research to incorporate that into her curriculum in third grade. And she was doing such a great job with incorporating different activities and getting the students really involved that the superintendent, F.H. Baer, actually asked her to expand the project to make it a district-wide program for third graders. So she did extensive research at the Western Reserve Historical Society, which, if you're not aware, actually has one of the most prominent Shaker collections in the country, the world, actually. So it's a great place to start researching if you're really interested in the Shakers. So that is where she did most of her research. There really wasn't anything available in Shaker Heights itself. And during this time, she developed a manuscript that would be used by teachers to teach the Shaker unit across the third grade. She also developed friendly relationships with people in the community. One important person was William Penty. He was the school custodian, but he had been a neighbor of the North Union Shakers. And Penty's aunt, Sarah Hecker, ended up loaning a lot of Shaker artifacts to Edythe Turner for use in the classroom. And then that kind of sparked a new type of collecting, where Edythe then reached out to other community members who had connections with the Shakers and kept gathering artifacts to use in her classroom, and again, across that third grade curriculum. And people in the community were more than willing to loan objects. I think everyone, from what I've read, it seems like there is a lot of people who were just excited that the objects that they had collected, again, many times from their neighbors, because they lived right next to the North Union Shakers, were able to be used in kind of an exciting setting with students. And a lot of those objects ended up being donated. So they were loaned for a long period of time and then donated. And this ended up forming the first permanent Shaker Schools collection of artifacts. So again, this was before the Historical Society was formed, but there was a collection of Shaker artifacts that was managed by the schools, specifically Edythe Turner. So these are some photographs from our collection. The one on the left is Edythe Turner's third grade class, and you can see that they're all in Shaker costumes. We have girls that are on the left side, taking up the majority of the photograph. You can see some boys in their costumes in the background, but very much sticking with the Shaker custom of keeping men and women separate. But she would do a lot of activities like this. It was very hands-on, a lot of involving costumes, plays, and of course, artifacts, which you can see in the photographs on the right. And by this point, I didn't have an exact year for these photographs, but it was still in the Shaker schools, and it was still before the Historical Society was formed. So I want to say it was the 30s, possibly early 30s. But she had acquired a significant number of objects. So a number of Shaker chairs, there's that tall like wardrobe chest at the top photograph. You can see some dresses, maybe a Dorothy cloak hanging on the wall in the top photograph. And then the lower photograph, a number of books, bonnets, hats, there's a doll there. And it looks like the chalkboard might be lined with some photographs or portraits of some of the Shakers. And again, these objects were very generously donated by Edythe Turner to the Shaker Historical Society when we've officially formed in 1947. So I can't say for sure that every single object that's seen in these photos is now in our collection, but a good number of them were donated to us, which we're very grateful for. So she was a charter member of the Shaker Historical Society, and was, in her words, the self-appointed curator of the Shaker Permanent Collection when it was at Malvern and Onaway schools. In addition to teaching in Shaker Heights, she also taught in Bucyrus, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan. I wasn't able to kind of lock in when those dates were, but I can confirm that she at least worked there for a portion of her life. And she was involved in several history and environmentally focused organizations throughout her life. So in addition to being a charter member of the Shaker Historical Society, she was also a charter member of the Bucyrus Historical Society and Friends of the Land, which was a conservation-focused nonprofit. She was also a member of the National Wildlife and Conservation Federation and the American Association of University Women. So she was very active in community-focused organizations. And she also traveled extensively around the world. And when I was doing research on Ancestry to kind of, just learn more about her as a person, because there isn't a lot about when she was born or when she died or anything in our collection. But I actually found a passenger list for the SS Columbus in 1939 that was headed to the West Indies and South America, and Edythe Turner is listed. So I thought that was kind of a fun nod to, or a fun thing to find, since I had read that she had traveled so much. And then Edythe Turner, she died on May 24th, 1984, and she is interred in Oakwood Cemetery in Bucyrus. And this photograph is actually the poor quality is because it's from the Plain Dealer, the online archives for the Plain Dealer. But Edythe Turner is the second from the left, And in this photograph, she's assisting on-away students with costumes for a school play. I've not been able to find any photographs of her in our collection. And actually the first photograph of her, this is from Ohio University's yearbook. So this was a photo of her in 1916. I haven't been able to find any photos of her in our collection, a lot of photographs of the things she collected and the programs that she put on. But the only photographs I have are this and then the one from the plain dealer. So I'm hoping to find more. So next up is Pearl Stark. She was born Pearl Lee in 1906 in Georgia. And like Edythe Turner, she went to Ohio University, but she graduated in 1928, so a decade later. And then she later obtained a master's degree from Western Reserve University. So she came to Shaker Heights in 1929. And when preparing for the Shaker unit that Edythe Turner had started, she realized there was very little written material on the North Union Shakers specifically. So at the time, she was living with the Pedley family on Kinsman, which is now Chagrin Boulevard. And they ended up connecting her with C.B. Palmer. And the Palmers lived in the Moses Warren house, which is the oldest house in Shaker Heights. And they also connected her with Louis Baus, who was a plain dealer photographer who is most well known for from our collection because of his photographs of the North Union Shaker community. Some from when the North Union Shakers were still there, but most of them from when the community dissolved. And Louis Baus had put together a scrapbook of these photographs that's in our collection. It's digitized and available on Cleveland Memory, but is probably one of the most well-known items from our collection because there aren't very many photographs of the North Union Shaker village. And if you're from Shaker Heights, you know that there are no structures standing anymore in terms of their meeting houses and their blacksmith shop and all of that. So the photographs are very useful for us, and Pearl Stark found them useful as well. So she had struck up relationships with people in the community who had connections to the Shakers, like Edythe Turner did. But Louis Baus in particular, they really had a good relationship, and he was more than happy to share photographs with her and her students. There are records of him making multiple visits to her classroom to give slide presentations of the photographs that he had taken. In 1930, she married pharmacist Paul N. Stark, so that's when she became Pearl Stark. And then during her first year of teaching, which was 1929 to 1930, she kept a diary about all of her teaching activities. I think they were kind of funny because the first page includes some questions that the students were asking. And either there's a slight exaggeration at how excited these students were to learn about the Shakers, or they were just very enthusiastic students. But according to her notes, the students really didn't know a lot about who had lived on the land. And so there was a keen interest, and that's really what sparked a lot of her activities and growing off of the work that Edythe Turner had started. But something that is kind of significant in this diary that she kept is just the vast amount of time that she devoted to the story of the Shakers. And there are very few days that are noted in her diary that don't reference the Shakers. And so it was a very important part of history for her that she wanted to communicate and share with her students. And she also lists just a number of activities that were really engaging. For the time period was not just reading from a textbook. I mean, especially in this case, there was no textbook on the Shakers, on the North Union Shakers, but she had just very skillful ways of inspiring curiosity in her third graders, despite having few resources. So she and Edythe Turner just did a really amazing job at connecting their students, and in general, all third grade students, which is when this curriculum took place, with the North Union Shakers. So as I previously mentioned, they had frequent talks with Louis Baus, the photographer, but they also welcomed Joseph and Alma Stoll, who were former Shakers. They had grown up in the Shaker community. So they frequently came and talked with the classes. The teachers led tours of historic sites from the North Union colony. They had the students correspond with other Shaker communities that were still in existence. So the students got to speak directly through letters with Shakers that were still around. And they also wrote and performed original plays to promote the Shaker story. So Pearl ended up donating her collection of materials to the Shaker Historical Society later in her life, which is how we know she was heavily involved in all of these projects. And she just really was passionate about teaching and teaching local history specifically. And she was named a Martha Holden Jennings Scholar for Excellence in Teaching in the 1960s. And then she retired in 1969. And then she ended up dying on October 10th, 1991, in Chardon. So these are some photographs related to Pearl Stark. So this, the top one on the left, these are some of the photographs, prints of photographs from Louis Baus that he provided to Pearl Stark to use in her classroom. So you can see that there are like some duplicates and stuff, but the photograph that's in the bottom right corner is one of the few photographs that we know of Elder James Prescott. So that would have been a really significant photograph for her to share with her students, because to this day, it's still considered the only photograph that we have of him. But I believe the photographs in the bottom left corner are of the Shaker's Holy Grove. You can see we have some cows in the upper left corner, and the upper right corner, I believe, is Doan Brook, which the two Shaker Lakes, Lower Lake and Horseshoe Lake, were formed when the Shakers dammed Doan Brook. And then the document that's on the right of the screen is Pearl's diary. So I don't know if this is the original. We have a couple of copies in our collection, so I'm not sure which one is the original and whether this is just a copy of it. But regardless, the information in it is just extremely valuable, and it's fairly thick. Again, she kept this over the course of her entire first year and wrote pretty frequently. But that is in our archives. It was donated along with her educational materials. So Carolyn Behlen Piercy was born December 31st, 1886 in East Cleveland. And her parents were from early German immigrant families, the Behlens and the Prayers, who were closely tied to each other, and they both operated vineyards. So she actually grew up in a cottage on a vineyard property, and she was the third of 7 children, so it was quite a full household. All of the children attended elementary school on Noble Road and then Shaw High School. And then after graduating, her brothers went into business or industry, but she and her sisters stayed at the house to tend the house and the vineyards. She did, however, end up graduating from Lake Erie College in 1910 with her AB, and ended up working at Hiram House, which was a settlement house to address the needs of immigrant and poverty-stricken populations under its founder, George Bellamy. And she worked there until 1913. She had a keen interest in, I just drew a blank, like social services. She had an interest in social services and helping people in the community. After leaving in 1913, she moved to England to study at the School of Economics at the University of London. And during her time in England, she traveled extensively across Europe because she felt it was important to better understand the immigrant populations that she had been working with in Cleveland. So there were, according to a profile that was written by her husband after her death, pretty much every holiday she had, she would travel somewhere new in Europe to either connect with family or, again, to better understand the populations that she had been working with when she was in Cleveland at Hiram House. So she returned to Cleveland in 1914, excuse me, and it just happened to coincide with the declaration of World War I in Europe. So she had very good timing on returning to the United States. And when she returned, she managed Trinity Social Settlement House near Trinity Cathedral. It only lasted about a year, partly because they were trying to help European immigrants, but World War I really complicated a lot of the work that they were trying to do. So she wasn't there for very long. In 1916, she married Dr. Harry D. Piercy, and they ended up having 2 daughters. So I started this slide by saying always active because when reading about her activities after having children, I feel like this woman probably couldn't have slept or slept very little. She was incredibly busy. She was very ambitious and motivated. So some of the things that she did, she took advanced German courses at Western Reserve University in the mid-1930s because she wanted to translate a biography of her great-great-grandfather, which she did end up doing, and it has some of her family's genealogical information in it. We unfortunately don't have a copy in our library. I was looking for it earlier, but it is widely referenced in genealogy related to like the Prayer family and some other ancestors. She also began making dolls in the late 1930s and early 1940s and joined the National Doll Society in the 1940s. And she wasn't a doll collector, but she felt that dolls had a very unique ability to connect kids with history and social movements and to each other. A hot phrase these days is social emotional learning. And I think that based on what she had said about dolls, I think that was a strong a strength of theirs. And so she again began making dolls, and in 1945 made a doll called Sylvia, the Shaker maid. But making a doll wasn't enough. She also decided to write a story from the perspective of Sylvia about her life in the North Union Shaker community. And these are just a few of the dolls. The Sylvia doll, she had made a couple of other dolls during this time. It was very active. In the 1940s, she also, on top of creating dolls and learning German and everything, she began creating small dioramas that were for the Western Reserve Historical Society. And because she was so good at it, she actually assisted the Western Reserve Historical Society professional staff with the construction of large dioramas at the museum as well. I love the story about how she became interested in forming a historical society. So while she's doing all of this, extremely busy, right? And just a keen interest in history and being involved in the local history community, she's at a party in the summer of 1945, and the topic of the Shakers comes up. She realizes that nobody at the party really knows who the Shakers are. They don't know who the North Union Shakers, they don't know the founding of Shaker Heights, or the people who were there before the Van Swearingens. And so she begins to just wildly research at the Western Reserve Historical Society, like her predecessors, Edythe Turner and Pearl Stark. It just is like gung-ho to figure out how she can bring the Shaker history to the community. So she ends up connecting through staff at the Western Reserve Historical Society with like-minded community members that include Reverend John Schott of Fairmount Presbyterian. And he's significant because he had done research on the Shakers already and had written a sermon, possibly a couple of sermons, on the Shakers and kind of how their beliefs could impact us in this day and age. So he had already done a lot of research and had an interest in the Shakers. So she connected with him. She connected with the Shaker School superintendent, William Slade, an attorney named Carrie Alburn, and then an interested community member named Norma Thrower. And they kind of all discussed their desire to inspire interest in the North Union Shakers through a historical society. So, oh, whoops, went ahead. The Shaker Historical Society was incorporated in 1947, and Carolyn Piercy was elected as secretary, and she served in this position for 4 to 5 years. And during this time, because at this point, I mean, it's clear that this woman liked to stay busy, she began working on the Valley of God's Pleasure, which was a manuscript that kind of was born out of all of the research that she had been doing on the North Union Shakers. So up to this point, there still wasn't kind of a good written resource on the North Union Shakers, and that became the Valley of God's Pleasure. So she finished it in 1950, was kind of looking for a publisher for a little bit, and with the help of the Shaker Savings Association, which was very community oriented, they were very involved in community projects, and heavily involved throughout art history with the Historical Society, promoting our events and local history in general. But the book was published in 1951. And then after she published this book, she directed her attention towards organizing a Shaker museum at her house in their rec room. So a lot of this time, like the 30s, trying to think of the timeline, it's in the exhibit, my goodness, I can't remember. So in the 30s, we were located in the schools. We ended up moving to the Shaker Heights Public Library, which is now the Stephanie Tubbs Jones Community Center. So when the library was located there, it opened in, I want to say 1950 or 1951. We have Megan on the call, so she can correct me if I'm wrong. But we operated the Shaker room out of the new library at the time. We ended up getting, we have a chat, let's see, 1951, thank you, Megan. So we ended up, the collection ended up having to get moved frequently, hence the title of our current exhibit, The Wandering Years. But at one point, the collection was housed in the Piercy household. So I can't imagine storing that in my house, but she seemed really excited to kind of work on organizing an exhibit and getting an inventory made of the collections objects that were at her house. She also published a Shaker cookbook in 1953, and then when that was done, shifted her focus to a manuscript on the early history of Warrensville. Unfortunately, the book remained unfinished due to her death in 1955, but the first section of the book, which was called The Forest Primeval, was published by the Historical Society in 1957, so 2 years after she passed. And during her last days, according to her husband, her mind was 100% on her work. And according to a quote from him, she said, "I must not die now. I have so much to do." So she, up until literally her last days, was just a powerhouse. She was instrumental in, obviously, the formation of the Historical Society, but also bringing local history to the community through publications and her extensive research. After her death, she died on April 2nd, 1955. Her husband, Harry, donated her personal library and her papers to the Historical Society. And so we have a lot related. We have a whole scrapbook that's related to her activities when she was trying to publish The Valley of God's Pleasure. It includes some original artwork and in correspondence, information about publicity. So it's a really interesting kind of peek behind the curtain during this very busy time in her life when she was focused on researching and publishing. So this is a photograph of her with her dolls, and it's kind of hard to read, but the book that's in the foreground is The Valley of God's Pleasure. So the photograph has to be from the probably early to mid 1950s. But again, she really viewed dolls as a way to connect children and people in general with history. And so a lot of the dolls that she specifically conceived of also came with little stories about their lives. It's almost like a early precursor to American Girl dolls. That's kind of what came to mind for me. But she went around the community with these dolls. I believe we have some advertisements for a program that she did with the dolls at Hallie Brothers department store. So she was just really eager to share local history with the public. And the certificate that's in the upper right corner is from the Western Reserve Historical Society. It was given to her in 1953 in recognition of outstanding contributions in the popularization of Ohio history. And this was included in one of the scrapbooks that we have of her materials. So I'm sure it was something that she really held dear to her because of her extensive experience volunteering for the Historical Society and just her passion for local history. So Frances Everhart, I do want to note before I start talking about Frances that so Carolyn Piercy passed away in 1955, and shortly after that, the Historical Society was able to secure a room at Moreland School. We were in room 11. And so after her death, there was a lot of work from women involved with the Historical Society, in particular, Elizabeth Nord, who we're going to get to in a little bit. But there was an effort to complete Carolyn Piercy's work to do an inventory of the collection's objects at her house. So she was not able to complete the project. And through the hard, patient work of some women involved with the Historical Society, they completed the first inventory in late 1955, early 1956 of the collection. And it is the earliest comprehensive record that we have of the Historical Society's collection, which makes it really valuable because prior to that, things would just be noted on pieces of paper or kind of scribbled somewhere. And so it was really hard to keep track of everything. So we moved into Moreland School in 1956, and then Frances Everhart comes into the picture. So Frances was born February 17th, 1881 in Alliance, Ohio. She worked in the Alliance schools in the 19-teens and 1920s, and then arrived in Shaker Heights in 1928. She started out as assistant to the superintendent, F.H. Baer, who was the one who encouraged Edythe Turner to expand her Shaker curriculum to make it a district-wide curriculum. So he was very interested in local history and these hands-on activities that the teachers and members of the public in the Historical Society were really promoting. She later became principal of Ludlow School and then Lowmont School. She retired in 1952 after 52 years of teaching, and 23 of those years were in Shaker Heights. 18 of those 23 were as the principal of Lowmont School. She was a charter member of the Shaker Historical Society and later became a trustee. And she was hired by the Board of Education as essentially the museum educator at Moreland School when the museum's collection was there. So she served as the educator from 1957 to 1966. And during her time as the kind of unofficial educator, she gave regular museum tours to 3rd and 5th grade students, and also served as the unofficial curator with Elizabeth Nord. So we have some mentions in our archives of her creating little special exhibits to commemorate anniversaries, or when they would get, a special donation, she would put together a little exhibit to highlight the new donation. She ended up retiring as the educator shortly before we had to move from Moreland School. So around 1966, 1967, she kind of officially retired. and donated her educational materials to the Shaker Historical Society. She was elected trustee emeritus in 1968, and then died 2 years later on February 16th, 1970. And she's interred in the Alliance City Cemetery. And this photograph was actually taken for an article in the Plain Dealer, but it's her showing third grader Edward Rinaldi how to operate a shaker apple parer in 1960. And these photos, the one that's on the right, she's wearing the same outfit because it was for the same article. But that's her with some shaker artifacts that were featured in room 11 at Moreland School when the Historical Society's collection was there. And the photograph that's on the left is her, she would arrange objects and photographs in kind of a display called the Museum Story that was for the 3rd and 5th graders in the Shaker schools. And she would do this quite frequently. I think it was a regular program, but then sometimes teachers would schedule special visits. And so she would give tours of the collection in the room that's seen on the right, but she would also set up these special exhibits. And then we come to the last woman that I want to highlight this evening, who is Elizabeth Cristy Nord. Elizabeth was born July 25th, 1880 in Massachusetts. She graduated from Flora Stone Mather College in 1903 and married lawyer Herman J. Nord in 1908. And they had 3 children together. She was a charter member of the Historical Society, the first corresponding secretary, first curator, longtime curator, and first trustee emeritus. I couldn't fit everything about Elizabeth Nord in this slide presentation because she was so instrumental to the Historical Society. I kind of saved her for last, not necessarily saving the best for last, but without her, the Historical Society would probably not still be around today. She, as the curator, she did extensive research. She was kind of instrumental in organizing the collection and getting collections records created. And really undertook a lot of projects to highlight local history in the community. So was heavily involved in historical markers around the community. But one really significant project that is significant for us now is her work with the Warrensville West Cemetery, which is located near Heinens. We are currently partnering with the city and the library to kind of bring that piece of history more out in the open. So the past year, the city got a grant to fund a preservation master plan for the cemetery, and Megan from the library and myself, representing the Historical Society, have been heavily involved in the history side of things. So researching those that are buried there, researching the history of the cemetery, and a lot of that work is building off of the work that Elizabeth Nord had already done. I will say she built off of work that was done by the Western Reserve Historical Society. So it wasn't from scratch, but she really added to a lot of it and did a lot of kind of genealogical research and connecting people that were buried there with their history in Shaker Heights. So early pioneers and immigrants from the Isle of Man, all the way to the 1950s. So in addition to kind of all of her work with local history, she also was heavily involved in the Clark-Lee Freeway fight. The Historical Society in general was heavily involved. We were some of the first community groups to really kind of start petitioning and gathering signatures and getting the word out there. And Elizabeth Nord, according to records that we have, was just tireless in her desire to not see a freeway come through Shaker Heights and destroy the Shaker Lakes. So like I said, there's there's so much that she has done for the Historical Society that it's impossible to list everything. But in 1970, City Council adopted a resolution recognizing her 90th birthday and all of her accomplishments. I feel like having City Council recognizing you is a sure sign that you've done a lot in your life. She was also heavily involved with the PTA outside of her work with the Historical Society. So she was very community oriented and minded in general. She also donated her personal collection of books to the Shaker Historical Society in June 1972. And then she died a couple months later on August 20th, 1972. And she's interred at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland. So the photograph on the left is from the Sun Press, and it's her gathering signatures on petitions against the Clark Freeway. She actually pops up a lot in newspaper articles related to the freeway because of how involved she was. The middle photograph is her in an authentic Shaker dress from Sabbath Day Lake, Maine. It was probably taken around the 1960s, but she had really great relationships with a lot of the surviving Shakers and other Shaker communities. She corresponded with a lot of people, not just Shakers, but also descendants of some of the early pioneers in Warrensville Township. So on top of all of the research that she was doing and programming, her being very, I'm sorry, my cat is currently going a little nuts off screen. Wanted to make sure there wasn't anything bad happening. She really did a great job of staying in touch with the descendants of people who were instrumental to the founding of Warrensville Township and Shaker Heights. So some of the materials we have from her in our collection are just the plethora of letters that she wrote to people to gather information or to share stories, to share research that she had uncovered. But one of the significant kind of pen pal relationships that she had developed was with Sister Mildred Barker. So the photograph that's on the right, Mildred Barker is sitting with the huge cake in front of her. But she was from Sabbath Day Lake, Maine, and her role in the community was to kind of spread the story of the Shakers and the Shaker faith. So she was almost like a community liaison. And she and Elizabeth Nord connected, had a really great relationship. And in 1960, they were able to bring Sister Barker to Shaker Heights to speak at a meeting for the Historical Society. And then the next day, she spoke with students at Moreland School. So we have some photographs from the event in our collection, but we also have the speech that she gave to both the Historical Society and the students. And pictured with them from left to right is L.M. Van Fossen. Then Elizabeth Nord is second in. I'm realizing that I left out the middle guy. Not sure who he is. Sorry about that. Then we have Mrs. James R. Stewart and Dr. Harry Piercy, who is the husband of Carolyn Piercy. So I feel like this quote from the Journal, our newsletter in October 1972, is kind of the best way to sum up Elizabeth Nord. It was shortly after she died, and they said, Ralph Waldo Emerson said that an institution is but the lengthened shadow of one man. The Journal would paraphrase that to say that our institution, the Shaker Historical Society, is the lengthened shadow of one woman. Mrs. Elizabeth B. Nord was that woman. A founding member of the society, its curator, a trustee, and its first trustee emeritus, Mrs. Nord literally built the organization from scratch. She never missed a meeting of the Board of Trustees. At an age when most people have long since retired, Mrs. Nord actively directed the removal of the museum from its Lee Road location to our present fine edifice on South Park Boulevard, which is the Myers Mansion that we're currently located in. So I just want to kind of go back to all of the women that I've talked about this evening. And it's interesting that there would be mentions of them, for example, Elizabeth Nord, where it says she built the organization from scratch. And while she was completely instrumental to it, we know that's not true. Carolyn Piercy was heavily involved as well. And then you see mentions of Carolyn Piercy. It's saying that she was the person who built the organization from scratch. But again, we know that's not true because Pearl Stark came before her. So again, one of the reasons I was so interested in this topic is just because we already know that throughout history, women tend to go unnoticed, unnamed. Even sometimes finding their first names is incredibly hard. You know, they just go as Mrs. Husband's name. And so I think that having the opportunity to highlight the women who were not only instrumental to the Shaker Historical Society, but just the passion for local history and the focus on the Shaker story in general. I don't think these women should be overlooked. And I'm just really excited to be able to bring their stories to you tonight. And hopefully we build off of this research that has been done to kind of learn more about them and better understand the impact that they had on the community. So I just want to kind of bring up a couple of other things that we are doing before I open it up for questions. So our current exhibit, The Wandering Years, the Early History of the Shaker Historical Society, is on view through May 30th. It is on our first floor, so it is wheelchair accessible. And we will be having a digital version of this exhibit. It's just not quite ready yet, but it will be available online within the next couple weeks. On April 15th, we're going to be opening an exhibit of photographs from our collection in the Lissauer Gallery, which is on our second floor. But as I was researching for the exhibit and pulling objects that relate to our early history, it's kind of amazing how many objects we have that are in storage that haven't been seen in years or possibly never been on view. So the fact that it's an art gallery seemed like the perfect opportunity to pull some photographs from the collection that are of particular interest, not necessarily from our early history, but from kind of throughout everything from 1947 to present. And then July 9th, we actually are having a new fundraiser called Shaker Soiree. It is a loving nod to the gracious gardens that we had in the past before the pandemic. But this will be a celebration in the gardens at the museum. And if you're interested in learning more, there is a page on our website. It's just shakerhistory.org/soiree. But we're really excited about this. And during my research for the exhibit, I actually found that the first social event of the Shaker Historical Society was supposed to be a garden party. We got rained out, so we had to hold the event indoors at the Western Reserve Historical Society, but that was kind of an unintended fun nod to the very first social event that we were supposed to have as a historical society. And I want to also mention again that this is our 75th anniversary. We are planning on having events and programs throughout the year celebrating our anniversary as well as the 200th anniversary of the North Union Shakers. But if you liked this program and you want to support us and support us for maybe another 75 years, you can do so at shakerhistory.org/grow/giving. And there is an opportunity to donate specifically for the 75th anniversary on there. So that is all for me. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, can I ask it, please?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I had a question about, do the Shaker schools still teach anything about the Shakers?
So to be honest, I'm not sure because I started, right before the pandemic hit. I want to say that they do teach about them, but I don't think it's to the extent that they used to, even like 10 years ago. So I know that in the past, again, like even a decade ago, we regularly had field trips to the museum. that got put on hold during the pandemic. We're really hoping to kind of revive field trips or educational opportunities where we go into the schools to talk about the Shakers. But I don't know for sure. I'm pretty sure they're part of the curriculum, but it's, Megan noted in the chat, it's no longer required. So with Edythe Turner, again, that became a whole district-wide third grade unit. Everyone had to do it, but it's no longer required.
Thank you.
I just wanted to thank you. I did not know about the first two women, and I was highly involved. I knew about Caroline Piercy and Mrs. Nord. I couldn't come up with her name.
Yeah.
And I have a picture. I have a lot of things for you, but and I'll drop them off at the museum. But I do have a picture of the three Palmer girls in their later years.
Okay.
In the Warren house. So I want to share that with you.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Yeah. But this was wonderful. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that it's, I mean, what you were saying, where a lot of the history of the Historical Society, when I initially started, you see Elizabeth Nord's name everywhere. You see Carolyn Piercy's name everywhere, which makes sense because they were super important to the history of not only the Historical Society, but just kind of the sharing of local history in the community. But I think that because Edythe Turner and Pearl Stark were connected more with the schools, they kind of get forgotten or left out of the story. When in reality, the collection that Edythe Turner started, it formed a large part of our collection, and they were founding members and charter members and like all of that stuff. So they're just as important. And I think that it's also just really interesting, you know, from the perspective of a historian, just to see how these women at a time when they, I mean, in 1924, they had just gotten the right to vote, right? So the fact that there were still so many limitations on women in society, but they had this huge impact where they could. And I find that to be very inspirational.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I'll see you soon.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I want to thank you again for joining us tonight. I'm kind of surprised I managed to wrap that up in an hour. I was really concerned because I feel like I could talk a lot about them. But this is going to be posted on our YouTube page within the next couple days. And I hope you enjoyed this and learned something tonight, and have a great evening.